finally, let's talk about reification. So I propose, and I kind of left this at the end for a purpose, but I propose this word is the most important word in your spiritual vocabulary. It comes from the Latin root re, which means thing. So reify, we can think about as to thingify something. What do you think that means? Any ideas? Anybody have an idea? What does it mean to thingify something? Any examples?
Depersonalize it. Take all the juice out.
Yeah, beautiful. Depersonalize it. Turn it into an object. How do we do that? What are some examples of ways we do that? Yeah, okay, abstraction. What else?
We also do that to protect our vulnerability.
100%, yeah. Distance. Yeah, distance. So try to feel, just in your body for a second, try to feel like an energetic level, the difference between the two statements I'm about to make, okay? That person is an addict. Okay, just get a sense. Okay, that's one statement. That person is struggling with addiction. You see, the difference is subtle, but when I just reified that person, I told you who that person is. They are an addict, right? That's a reification. Versus that person is struggling with addiction. Oh, that person is mentally ill versus that person is struggling with some mental illness issues. Doesn't one feel more like that's who they are? That's where they will always be, right? That's a reification. So what the mind does, the mind is constantly reifying things. It's thingifying things. So many of you know the wonderful physicist who's very popular right now because he's a wonderful writer, Carlo Rovelli. Anybody know that name? Yeah, so Carlo Rovelli, he's a gravitational physicist. And here's what he says. He says, we used to think the world was made of things and happenings. We used to have this dichotomy. There's things in the world and there's happenings. And he said a thing would be an example of like a stone, and a happening would be an example of something like a kiss. So we used to, so you can say, hey, do you know where that stone is? I brought that stone. Do you know where I put it, But we can't really say, do you know where that kiss is? We had it yesterday and I can't find it anywhere. Like I looked under the bed, I looked in the bathroom, like where is that, right? So we make this dichotomy of these two things. He says, but now what me and my colleagues have discovered is that there are no things. There's only happenings working in more expansive senses of time. A stone is just a happening that looks frozen to us for a moment, but is not frozen, it's dynamic and moving. It's just moving at a slower pace. I have a wonderful relationship with a bunch of natural historians, and we do events at the farm and stuff. And so they were coming out and talking about the pollinators, and they were teaching me that certain bees see something like they have the visual processing that's 20 times faster than we are. So we look like the, we're like, and you're like, and they're so fast you can barely ever see them, right? So again, they're seeing even more things because they're moving so fast. If we move slower, right, we would just see this dynamic movement through time. So he says, what we've realized is there are no things, there are only happenings. So when we're talking about reification, or when we're talking about de-reification, we're talking about the moving from things to happenings. Now the question is, who cares? And I think it's the most important spiritual question we can always ask. Like, we always got to come back to who cares. But Cecily,
David Bohm cares.
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, all these physicists are...
All the physicists
yeah,
because they say that we're connected to everything through a biofield.
Yeah.
And the biofield sustains us, maintains us.
Yeah.
So we're connected to all things that have vibration.
Yeah.
And stone has vibration.
Totally.
And all things that live.
I think certainly we see this in physics, but I also propose we see it in Christianity, we definitely see it in Buddhism, and we definitely see it in Vedanta. I think these three areas are really rich with the insight of why this matters, okay? So let me, by way of kind of now finishing up with this idea of why does this matter, let me, if you don't mind, tell you a quick story. So I was in retreat. I was about my second year into retreat. And some of you heard this story. I told it in the same room. I think you heard this story, but years ago, 8 years ago. But I'm laying in retreat, and I'm looking up at the ceiling. And yeah, so I started my retreat day at 3 a.m. every morning. It was what was my first meditation session. So I'm waking up. It's like 2:50, and the room's dark. And I just see a big black splotch right above my head on the ceiling. That's not a comforting thing to see, right? So I get my headlamp and I flash it on there, and it was the largest, most terrifying insect I've ever seen in my life. I didn't have internet, obviously, so I didn't know what it was until another 2 years, but it turned out to be a creature called a whip scorpion. Go home and look them up. Don't do it before bed, though. But they're about this big, and they're like a cross between a scorpion and a lizard. They have the tail of a lizard, and they're just massive legs with claws. And I was totally freaked out. I was like, retreat's over. I'm out of here. I didn't know these, I didn't know what it was. I'd lived in the desert most of my life. I had no idea what this was. I didn't know if it was going to kill me or anything. So I eventually got it in a jar, which was, my whole body was like this, and I was like just really not having a great time with that. And I brought it out into the evening, morning stars, right? And where I did retreat in the Chiricahua Mountains, it's just like beautiful night sky, just so vivid, no lights for hundreds of miles, you know? And I had this moment happen that was so interesting. So what happened was, there I am holding this thing, and I'm literally shaking because I'm so freaked out. And I look up at the night sky, and I just see the full Milky Way. And you know, every now and then, it's cliche to say it, but every now and then you just really are full of the awe of what we're actually dealing with. Like we're literally on like in some side neighborhood of the galaxy, and we're on a little planet, and nobody has any idea what we're doing, and we're just like, it's just the tininess of it and the magnificence. And all of a sudden, my heart just completely broke open for love for this fellow earthling. Like, I realized you and I are exactly the same. We're just on Earth. And we're like, I don't know any more about what I'm doing than you do. And I felt him as a brother. And I even had this thought sneak into my head that I'm going to bring him back into my room because I don't want anything to happen to him. It was like slightly absurd, right? I didn't, by the way. But, and then what happened is my mind then switched again to like, no, this thing is disgusting, right? And so what happened over the next 5-10 minutes, as I just sat there in this very weird state, is my mind moved back and forth very quickly in a way that I was able to observe the moving. And you got to remember, I'm 2 years into a meditation, so I'm able to be an observer consciousness for a lot of the functioning of the mind. So there was a Jane Goodall part of me that was just watching what's happening with the reactivity around a frightening experience. And what I saw for the first time in my life is the reification and the de-reification process happen over and over again. And here's the interesting thing. So, right, the reification was what? What would the reification of that be? Yeah, enemy. I mean, the reification was really enemy. Bad person, enemy, right? What would the de-reification be? Yeah, that is a fellow earthling. Yeah, a fellow loved one, really, you know. And it was the opening of the heart. So energetically, it was contraction and expansion. And that's what reification is, a contraction, and de-reification is an expansion. But here's where it gets interesting. What I observed is every time I contracted, I had a reduction of anxiety. So interesting. Let me say that again. Every time I contracted, every time I reified, every time I labeled enemy, anxiety was reduced. I was more at ease because I had a clarity of enemy. And then every time I opened and I expanded, I had an increase of anxiety, which is also another way of saying that is an increase of vulnerability. And I realized labeling enemy creates a reduction of anxiety. Watch the news with that mindset. And watch how, on one level, the news creates anxiety and then tries to, because it's a false reduction of anxiety. Do you see what I mean? It appears to be a reduction of anxiety, but there's a secret anxiety that's creeping up underneath that. I was like, okay, there's more enemies. I have to be more careful, you know. But watch the news. The news is all about reifying human beings as enemies, as good and bad. Yeah, the old us and them trick, you know. And it was so blatant, of course, back in you were talking about Russia, and you know, back in the day when you see propaganda posters, right, and the enemy is always like snaggle-toothed, and like, you know, the Russians were like, you know, they're gonna eat your children, and you know, but that's what we do to enemies. We reify them and then deform them, distort them. And again, I'm proposing that creates a reduction of anxiety, which is such a weird thought to think about. So what we learn in meditation is we actually learn to be able to endure the discomfort of a de-reified perspective. In meditation, we learn to endure the discomfort of a de-reified perspective, which also means we increase internal freedom. Because every labeled enemy is a reduction of your freedom. And you know this. You're walking down Southport Boulevard or whatever. You see somebody that irritates you. What's physically happening in your body when you're like, oh my God, I have to interact with this person? There's a contraction. Yeah, you contract. Are you more free or less free than you were 5 minutes ago, right? You're less free. You're contracted. The Tibetans have a funny saying. They say, when you label enemy, it's like eating rat poison and waiting for the rats to die. My contraction, you know, let's say Mark and I are in an argument, right? My contraction, it doesn't hurt Mark. All I'm doing is hurting myself, you know. I'm contracting myself. So, you know, really what we're talking about with meditation is ultimately, right? Meditation is, you know, it's being marketed as like feel good and feel better, and I think there's a lot of problems to that. The real benefit of meditation is wake up to the ways that the mind is keeping us from freedom. And this is where St. Teresa comes in so beautifully. She has a model of the spiritual life being like, she says, like basically an agave plant or an onion, you know, the different layers around it. And in the center of the onion is Christ, right? Christ consciousness. A full union with the divine, right? And on the outer levels are all are different layers that we have to get through. And she says the thing is, and she uses the analogy of Christ playing a flute, which is very Krishna, by the way, because Krishna plays a flute, and that's how he draws people into the spiritual life, is through the beauty of the flute. Who is it? Graham, who wrote the Toad and Frog and Toad?
Yeah, oh boy. I can't remember the author, but...
Wonderful Christian writer who wrote that. And he's also bringing in this metaphor, because at one point, Frog or Toad, it's something green. Graham Greene, I think it is. No? All right, anyway. But so at one point, Frog or Toad, I forget which one, go back and read it, it's wonderful. But they hear a flute that opens their heart. And it's just like, and we've all had that moment where we suddenly feel realigned, and oftentimes it happens with grief. Grief oftentimes realigns us to like, wow, what have I been wasting my time focusing on all this time? It's like, you know, Kenneth Graham, yeah, great. Yeah, Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Graham. Wonderful book. But so it's like, what, you know, those wake-up moments, and oftentimes they're a health scare, they're a frightening diagnosis, but they're that moments of like, it's wake up now, you know, what am I wasting my time on? And that's what St. Teresa talks about with the flute at the center of, sometimes she calls it a castle too. The centermost room of this castle is when we hear Christ's flute. And we're drawn into that through all of these, she says, like these outer rooms full of serpents and scorpions, and, which is just all the drama that everything you see on the news, it's just drama. You're gonna get the news that you need to get. We have this illusion that if we don't watch the news 24/7, we're not being responsible citizens. I completely reject that. I 100% reject that. I think what we're doing when we watch the news is we're just training the mind in reification. We're training the mind to limit capacity. I've done experiments where for 1 week, I'll watch Fox News. And then for 1 week, I'll watch like CNBC or something, And by the end of each week, I'm like, oh my God, the liberals are crazy. Oh my God, the conservatives are crazy. But I happen to be in a unique position where I am very surrounded by both extremes. I have, both extremes of that. And guess what? We're all human beings, right? And we all love our families. We all are frightened about things that are, there's so much humanity there that we forget. I oftentimes, I happen to be around a lot of people that are called, are transgender, because I have a lot of young people come to the farm. And when I hear people that are disturbed by that, I'm like, how many transgender people have you gone out to lunch with? And if that's a disturbing concept for you, I think find somebody to go out to lunch, and just or whatever it is that triggers you, whatever it is where you feel yourself start to contract, get out of the news and go meet them and see where they're really at. And again, what we're talking about is the de-reification process. And that's all I have to share. Yeah, so thank you all so much. And really, thank you for your endurance. We just covered so much material that it's ridiculous. So here's what I recommend. If there's a group of you, it's really helpful to go back and revisit this within a week or so. This is how I was trained to study in the monasteries. You don't just put the notes away, but you particularly don't revisit it on your own. Find somebody to have a cup of tea with, and just go back through each point and kind of remind yourself. And then you really start to integrate the material.